You've heard of haunted houses, but what about haunted history itself? Welcome to Spookology, the podcast where your hosts, Keek and Cardi, unearth history's weirdest haunts, crimes, and cursed corners. From medieval murder mysteries and sinister seances to abandoned asylums and folklore with a vengeance, they cover it all with a shovel in one hand and sarcasm in the other. They're snarky, they're scholarly, they're slightly possessed. Whether you're a history nerd with a dark side, a ghost enthusiast with a love of footnotes, or just someone who likes your crime served with a side of cursed energy, Spookology is the podcast you didn't know you were dying for. New episodes drop regularly wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in if you dare, but don't worry, the ghosts are mostly friendly. Probably.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Down the Crooked Path is researched and recorded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga of Credit First. This land has been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and we recognize their enduring connection. We are grateful to share these stories on their lands that carry their histories, and we encourage our listeners to reflect on the past, present, and future of the land they call home. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian Creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Wilno, Ontario is the kind of place that people drive through with the windows down, breathing in pine air and the scent of wood smoke. Nestled in Ontario's highland, it offers postcard views and a pace slow enough to feel like a different century. That there's a church that chimes on the hour, even when no one's inside. And a diner where the coffee is always fresh, but the cook never speaks. Locals wave from porches with that same gentle smile, warm, practiced, and just a little too identical. Visitors call it charming. Long-timers call it quiet. But few ask why the cemetery gate is always locked. The town of Wilno doesn't welcome questions. Ask about the shadows on the hillside or the strange symbols etched into the oldest gravestones, and you'll get a polite shrug, maybe a change of subject, maybe silence. Older folks claim there's nothing to tell, just stories, just wind, just nonsense. But behind lace curtains and half-drawn blinds, there's an understanding that some things are better left unspoken. Children are taught not to whistle after dark, and if an animal's found drained in the woods, it's chalked up to coyotes, even when there are no tracks. Wilno may never say the word vampire, but it remembers it's dead. Long before the forest had roads and the land had borders, settlers from Kashubia arrived in what would become Wilno. They came with little, save for what could be packed into crates and carried across the ocean. Their prayers, their songs, and their warnings. In the late 1800s, these Polish pioneers carved homes from timber and faith, building Canadian's oldest Polish settlement on a ridge where the pines watched like sentinels. They built churches, dug wells, and marked the land with names pulled from a language thick with vowels and memories. The winters were long, the nights were longer, and with every passing year, the old country didn't fade. It just folded itself into Wilno soil. Traditions stayed close to the hearth: harvest dances, card viginankis, and the quiet custom of lighting candles on All Souls' Day. Stories told in the kitchens spoke of owls as messengers, dreams as warnings, and the need to bury the dead with care. The people didn't speak of vampires, not openly, but there were customs that were endured without explanation. Garlic strung in barns, mirrors turned towards the wall, and graves dug deep with heavy stones. Folklore followed them across the Atlantic, even if the language to name it stayed behind. Vampires didn't always wear black coats or charm their way through velvet parlors. In the traditions carried by the Kashubians and Polish settlers, the idea of the vampire was older, rougher, and far more feared. Long before Bram Stoker imagined castle ruins and foreign nobility, stories across Eastern European warned of beings that returned from the grave not to seduce, but to harm. The settlers of Wilno brought those stories with them, quietly sewn into bedtime prayers and burial rites. There were two types of vampires spoken in these communities. The first were corpse returners, those believed to rise physically from the grave, almost like zombies. These beings emerged from freshly buried soil with bloated bodies and darkened skin, drawn not by romance, but by hunger. They could attack livestock or neighbors, especially if they had wronged someone in life or had been improperly buried. Physical signs were sought in the corpse itself. If a body did not decay as expected or was found with blood at the mouth, the community grew anxious. In the old villages of Poland and the Balkans, some families could exhume the dead to confirm suspicions. If the signs were present, they might drive a stake through the body, burn the heart, or bury the remains with heavy stones to prevent return. The other kind of vampires were more subtle. They were known as psychic vampires, unseen and often unnamed, blamed for misfortune, wasting illness, and sudden accidents. They didn't rise from the graves, but they lingered around the living, draining vitality without ever appearing. Crops failed, animals grew thin, and children grew pale. In Poland and among the Kashubians, this type of affliction might be blamed on the restless dead or on a curse. Protective measures were taken in silence, with garlic laid at doorways, iron tools placed at the foot of the bed, or the careful placement of religious icons. Not everyone believed openly, but few dared to ignore the customs. Across Slavic and Balkan regions, similar figures existed under different names. In Romania, the strogai were restless spirits that could return to torment family members. In Siberia, the vampire was said to rise physically and could even marry and raise children if undetected. Bulgaria spoke of the obor, which might feed on blood or fear. These stories shaped how communities treated death and how they understood illness. It was never just superstition, it was about survival. In Wilno, the whispers faded over time, but traces remained. Some older graves lacked surnames, marked only with symbols. A few were buried far from the others, past the trees where the land sinks with frost. The tales of the vampires were not told directly, especially as generations modernized. But for those who still lit candles on All Souls' Days, for those who still placed iron near the doorframe, the memory of the old lays lives quietly. In 1972, commissioned by the National Museum of Man in Canada, Slavic linguist and folklorist Dr. Jean-Louis Perkowitz published a report titled Vampires, Dwarves, and Witches Among the Ontario Kubashi. The study was part of the museum's Mercury series and focused on the Kashubian Polish community in and around Wilno, Ontario. Perkowski had spent some time in the region between 1968 and 1967, conducting interviews with residents, many of whom were descendants from the original Kubashian settlers who arrived in the middle of the 19th century. His goal was to document linguistic patterns and folk beliefs that had survived immigration and adapted to Canadian life. The report was methodical, but its contents were unsettling. Perkowski recorded first-hand accounts of supernatural beliefs, including detailed descriptions of vampiric entities known as Yesi and Wopchis. These were not the romanticized vampires of literature, but folkloric beings rooted in Slavic tradition. The Yesi was said to be marked from birth, often by a cull, and destined to return from the grave unless specific rituals were performed. A cull is membrane that comes from the uterus as the baby is being born. If this was found on top of the baby's head, it was a symbol that they could return as vampire after death. It could also mean that the child was marked with supernatural and psychic abilities, having a link to the world of the dead. In these cases, the cull was often kept, dried, or even buried separately. Otherwise, it could continue exerting power. The whoop she identified by sharp teeth at birth, particularly 2 teeth, and it was believed to become a vampire after death with no known cure. Protective burial customs included placing sand or nesting in the coffin to delay the vampire's escape, burying the body face down, or inserting coins or crosses beneath the tongue. Burkowski's informant spoke of signs: blood drawn from the living, bruises in the shapes of rings, and corpses that refused to decay. Some described exhumations, decapitations, and rituals performed at midnight to prevent further deaths. One account detailed a child who stirred before burial, prompting a neighbor to draw blood from the child and administer it to the dying mother. The mother recovered. The child was buried. These stories are recorded both in English and Kashubian dialects, with Perkowski including untranslated transcripts to preserve linguistic accuracy. The report caused a stir. It was debated in the Canadian House of Commons and criticized by residents who felt misrepresented. Many claimed that the stories were taken out of context or exaggerated. Scholars later placed Perkowitz's work alongside other studies of Slavic vampirism, including Montagu Summers' theological treatise and Alan Dundee's folkloric analysis. But unlike Summers, Perkowski didn't see to prove the existence of vampires. He documented belief as it was expressed, raw, regional, and deeply personal. Today, vampires, dwarves, and witches among the Ontario-Kashubs remains a controversial artifact. It is rarely cited in Wilno, where many residents prefer to focus on cultural heritage rather than supernatural lore. Yet the report endures in academic circles, offering a rare glimpse into how old world beliefs adapted to new soil. It is not quoted often, but it is remembered.
Once upon a time, in the land of everyday moments, there lived a sprinkle of magic called icing sugar photography. From sticky cake smash smiles to wind-swept yes moments, they capture the sugar sweet, the beautifully messy, and everything in between. Whether you're a blushing bride or a blooming family, or just want to freeze time for a second, icing sugar photography is your fairy god lens. Visit icingsugarphotography.com and follow along on Instagram at icingsugarphoto. Let your story sparkle, because life is sweet and memories should be too.
Superstitions gave way to odd behaviors in life and also stirred unease. A man who never slept well and avoided garlic without explanation. A woman who remained emotionless through her mother's funeral, only to be seen smiling at the grave days later. People remembered these things, not as accusations, but as patterns that couldn't be ignored. They became quiet reference points, signs that something might not be resting easily. Of greater concern were deaths that remained unresolved. Suicides, in particular, brought spiritual concern. Church records often omitted such deaths from hallowed ground, and not just for religious reasons, but because the soul was thought disturbed. Improper burials, such as those with no priest present, missing a rite, or a body buried too shallow, could also invite misfortune. Worst of all, when an animal, particularly a dog or a cat, jumped over a fresh grave. In that moment, they said something might be transferred. A spark, a breath, a tether. Perkowski described how families sometimes performed safeguards. A sick relative's mirror was turned to the wall. Their clothing burned rather than passed on. If blood appeared at the lips days after death, if a body refused to decay, these were signs. Not proof, never that, but enough to bring a priest back to the gravesite, to add iron nails to the coffin lid, or sprinkle holy water beneath the earth. Vampiric turning was rare, they said. It wasn't passed like a plague, but rather it rooted itself in grief, in oversight, and in spiritual imbalance. A family known for tragedy might be whispered about. The eldest son always pale, the daughter never seen in church. A curse didn't need to be named to exist. It was enough that people kept their curtains closed at dusk, that they held mass not just for the living, but in case the dead might come listening. Burial rites in Wilno were quiet affairs, but they were never simple ones. Stories circulated about how the dead were laid to rest. They went beyond honoring their lives and into ensuring that the dead stayed buried. The settlers, mostly Kashubian in origin, carried centuries of ritual folklore into the forested folds of Ontario. With them came customs, some clearly Catholic, others far older and harder to trace. One of the most persistent measures involved iron. In certain cases, iron rods or bars were laid over coffin lids before burial. The material was believed to bind the spirit, preventing it from rising or influencing the living. Iron held symbolic weight. It was strong, unforgiving, and unyielding to magic. In the Old World, scythe and iron tools were sometimes placed in graves for similar reasons. In Wilno, iron was kept hidden beneath the soil, never spoken about out loud after the funeral ended. There are also accounts of bodies being buried face down. The reasoning was simple. If a soul attempted to rise, it would burrow deeper into the earth rather than find its way out. This practice was reserved for the especially feared and unsettled, those who died violently, those whose death brought strange winds or sudden illness. No church records confirmed it, but older grave diggers remember. There were some families who insisted on garlic, tucked into pockets, placed under the tongue, sometimes even woven into small wreaths and placed at the feet. Garlic had no official place in Catholic rite, but it lingered in the margins, brought out quietly when the deaths came too close together or when dreams of the deceased refused to fade. Stakes, those were rare, more rumor than rule, but they were mentioned, albeit quiet ones, of wooden stakes driven through the chest, not violently, but as a safeguard. It wasn't about punishment, it was prevention. Deep graves mattered too, not just to avoid scavengers, but to add distance to whatever remained below from affecting what walked above. Still, despite precautions, some deaths stirred more than grief. Town records began showing patterns, odd timing, uncanny repetitions. A son buried in October, followed by his sister in January, then a cousin, pale and coughing, removed from school by spring. Consumption was always the word scribbled in the margins, but not everyone was convinced that illness alone was sweeping through Wilno. Whispers lived longer than diagnoses. Church logs at St. Mary's occasionally noted irregular burials or interments conducted under special instruction from family. One entry from 1891 notes a burial conducted without full rites at the family's request. Another dated 1894 mentions a child laid to rest with protective measures. The language is careful, but the implications are clear. Something about these deaths unsettled the community. Parishioners passed down stories in murmurs. A woman who refused to let her daughter attend a wake, fearing that the spirit hadn't properly settled. A man planted rowan trees near his livestock after his brother's sudden death, claiming it protected the animals from whatever took him. One account scribbled in the back of a family Bible tells of a boy who vanished during winter. Some say that he ran away. Others say he had gone into the lake ice and never returned. But his grandmother swore she saw footsteps trailing from his bedroom window to the edge of the woods, but none returning. Locals whispered about the Etimansky farm, where 14 people reportedly died over the span of a year. One woman claimed her daughter woke up with a ring-shaped bruise on her arm and felt drained for days. It was a vampire, she said, though she never told anyone at the time. The story was passed down quietly, like a warning wrapped in secrecy. Another tale, never formally reported, recalls a child buried without shoes. The family said it was poverty. A neighbor said it was precaution, claiming that the spirits with bare feet couldn't walk far. That same winter, the family's youngest began coughing. One of the most chilling accounts, though, comes from a woman who recalled a burial where the child stirred before being laid to rest. The neighbor drew blood from the child's lingering finger and gave it to the dying mother. The mother recovered. The child grew cold. We buried it, she said, and then we never spoke of it again. These stories weren't written in newspapers or shouted in town squares. They live in the kitchens, in parlors, passed down from grandmother to grandchild. They were a part of Wilno's quiet resistance to the unknown, not hysteria, not spectacle, just a community trying to make sense of suffering with the tools it had, and including a deep respect for the mysteries of death. What makes these stories even more poignant is how far they echo and how closely they mirror another place, another time, where grief dove into superstition when science failed. In 19th century New England, tuberculosis hollowed out homes over months, sometimes years, with a merciless patience that bred suspicion. One child, then a sibling, then a father. The disease never seemed to leave. It simply moved on to someone new, and in that tread grew superstitions. The response was panicked. Entire towns rallied around their fear, digging into frozen ground to exhume the recently buried. They lit fires not for warmth, but for purification. Hearts were removed from corpses and turned into ash, bones rearranged, and bodies inspected for signs of unnatural life, such as fresh blood in the heart, a flushed face, a corpse that refused to rot. Villages gathered at midnight not for vigil, but for vengeance against what they believed had returned from the grave. Where Wilno salted thresholds and stitched its fears into the quiet linings of coats and coffins, New England laid theirs bare for the village green. It was public, communal, and unflinching. Protective rites in Wilno were passed down through generations, folded into daily life like prayers. But in New England, belief turned into performance. Rituals enacted in front of neighbors, witnessed by clergy, and written up in local newspapers. And yet, at the center of both most likely stood the same ghost: illness. Today, Wilno holds its folklore close, but not openly. Ask about old burial customs, and you'll often be met with polite deflections or a quiet smile. Residents rarely speak of vampires, and many avoid the topic altogether. It's not denial, it's more preservation. The stories are seen as private, almost sacred. To speak of them too freely risks turning them into spectacle. One local historian said, "I am sick and tired of all this vampire nonsense." A reluctance to let outsiders define what was once whispered between generations. For some, it's a quiet protest against the decades of sensationalists that overshadow their real heritage. In the 1970s, when Dr. Jan Bukowski published his research on Wilno's vampire lore, the town was thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. Headlines painted it as a place of superstition and fear. The residents pushed back. They said the stories were misunderstood, exaggerated, or simply not true. Since then, many have chosen to not engage. The lore became a quiet legacy, something known but not discussed. Bukowski probably didn't expect for this study to echo for decades. His intent was academic, to document cultural beliefs around vampires, burial customs, and linguistic patterns. But outside Wilno, the response took a different tone. Media headlines focused on the most sensational parts: blood rituals, graves reopened, whispered warnings, and suddenly, Wilno was painted as Canada's vampire town. It's a label that the town has never claimed. Locals felt misread. Stories were stripped of nuance and context. Folklore, rich with symbolism and cultural meaning, was portrayed as superstition and horror. And that created real tension. Historian Joshua C. Blaine called it the Bukowski effect. It's a lingering mistrust of outside research. He described the report as lacking context, with transcripts that confused metaphor for fact. David Scholl, one of Wilno's heritage leaders, was even more blunt. He said, "If you're looking at a vampire story, basically our identity was sucked right out of us." That quote stuck. Not because it's about vampires. It's about ownership of your own story. It's about how a community's memory can be reshaped, even hijacked by how it's interpreted. And now the landscape is shifting. Younger generations are moving away. Some only return for holidays or family funerals. Others settle in cities where tradition fades beneath modern life. With each departure, the thread weakens. The rituals, salt, iron, garlic, these are remembered but not practiced. And the stories are known but not told. A few elders still carry them, but they speak less often, not out of shame, but because fewer people are asking. Superstition, like language, needs repetition to survive. Without it, it becomes a memory, and memory, over time, becomes myth, or worse, forgotten. Yet the silence doesn't mean the stories are gone. They linger in the way people pause before naming what they fear, in the way graves are still dug deep, in the way some doors still have salt tucked beneath the frame. The lore lives on quietly, like a shadow that moves when no one's looking. We bury bodies, yes, but also memories, doubts, stories we'd rather not explain. In Wilno, what's buried isn't just folklore. Buried in the soil is the tension between myth and meaning. Pride and heritage runs deep here. Gabashian music, language, and memory are celebrated. But the superstition? The vampire tales documented by outsiders may have faded from conversation, but they linger, like fog on the ridge, not gone, just unspoken. Superstition gave way to pride, and silence has now become tradition. But that silence has weight. Ask about vampires, and folks won't say much. Maybe they don't believe. Maybe they do. But maybe saying it aloud stirs something best left undisturbed. Maybe these stories aren't just relics. Maybe they're tools. Ways to name grief, caution, and fear. And maybe not speaking of them now is still a way of using them. We choose what to remember. We choose what to repeat. But what we bury, that's what defines us most of all. Thank you for listening.
That was an eerie journey down the crooked path with Amanda. How cool was that? If you loved it, don't forget to follow Down the Crooked Path on Instagram and TikTok. Amanda shares some really fun interactive content over there. And trust me, it gets even creepier. Down the Crooked Path is our sister podcast, and you can catch new episodes every Thursday wherever you get your podcasts. So if you're into the paranormal, folklore, and strange little corners of the world, we've got you covered.